Hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome to my session, Depression and Suicide Prevention. My name is Wendy Sweeney. I am the manager for PANDA. PANDA provides Minnesota ABE, physical and non-apparent disability assistance. And I'm also a licensed psychologist, so I will be speaking from my expertise in the mental health field on today's workshop. So I wanted to just start out to mention our website. If you have not visited our website before, I would highly encourage you to do so. It was developed for adult basic ed teachers in Minnesota, and there are several categories on the right side that you see there. And one of those categories is mental health. So if you have any further questions after this workshop or want to find additional resources, I would encourage you to go to that mental health category for more information. So before I talk about the objectives, I want to make sure that all of you are able to find the participant folder right above the link that connected you to this workshop. There are 3 handouts available there for you, and 2 of them we will be using for a role play we will be doing in a breakout session. So if you can print up the QPR suicide prevention handout and the suicide resources handout, that'll really help you during that role play, or if you can pop them up on your screen, either way. And then the last handout is a participant handout. It just kind of follows along with what I'll be talking about today, and has all the links that I also will be referring to. And so today we will be talking about the prevalence of suicide, mainly in Minnesota. I'll be talking about causes, risk factors, and warning signs. And then we will be, I'll be teaching you an evidence-based suicide prevention method, which then you'll have an opportunity to role play and practice. And then also be lastly brainstorming some proactive suicide prevention measures that you can use with your students in class. I do want to mention that this talking about suicide is a very touchy subject. In our culture, people generally are not comfortable talking about death or don't know what to say when somebody dies. And we certainly do not want to talk about somebody who doesn't want to live. So this can be a very touchy subject. And I want to just mention that some of the information we'll be talking about could be a trigger for some of you, whether you know somebody who died by suicide or you yourself have had any thoughts about not wanting to live. It could be a trigger for you. And so if that's the case, please feel free to step away, and but feel free to contact me if you need any support at all. So I'm going to start out by talking about the prevalence of suicide in Minnesota, just to give you some background about some of the numbers. Suicide is the leading cause of all deaths in Minnesota, and it's the 10th nationally. There were 723 deaths by suicide in 2020 in Minnesota, unfortunately. That's the most recent statistics that I have. However, it was a decrease from the year prior. So that's good news, bad news, but it seems that some of these suicide prevention methods are helpful, obviously. Males make up 80% of suicides. Firearms account for over half of all suicides. And American Indians have the highest suicide rate, sadly. So I want to talk about some of those cultural differences in Minnesota. We do have a high population of American Indians, Native American Indians in ABE classes. And so I think it's important for you to understand that the reason it seems that there's higher rates of suicide with American Indians, it's 1.5 times higher than the national average. And that's due to that history of alienation and historical trauma, lots of history of mistreatment and being felt to be marginalized. And then there's a high rate of abuse and unemployment in our Native Americans. But suicide happens across all races and cultures across the world. So it doesn't discriminate. There's on average 800,000 people die by suicide across the world. So it's obviously an important topic to talk about. So this is a very thought-provoking quote that I like to share. Every 40 seconds, someone in the world dies by suicide. And every 41 seconds, somebody is left to make sense of it. It devastates those left behind, the loved ones left behind, but it's nobody's fault, and it's devastating. I want to share a book that I read called Shattered, From Grief to Joy After My Son's Suicide, written by a woman named Rebecca Turbo. And she described the loss of her 17-year-old son who died by suicide, that she went into a deep, dark pit of despair and grief. She felt shame and guilt about what she might have done or what she didn't do or what she didn't notice. And it really just prevented her from talking to anyone about it, because it is an uncomfortable situation for those around her. They didn't know what to say to her. So I wanted to just share how it feels for those left behind. So this is another quote that I wanted to share from the National Institute of Mental Health. Suicidal thoughts and actions are a sign of extreme distress, not a harmless bid for attention, and should not be ignored. I remember a client telling me that their teenage daughter was just being full of drama when she was talking about not wanting to live. So she was just ignoring it and not paying any attention to it. And I had to educate her that no, indeed, any time there's any comments about not wanting to live, it should be taken very, very seriously. So I want to talk about depression because 70% of those who attempt suicide have been either diagnosed with depression or may have been undiagnosed. But some of the symptoms to be aware of are a wearing away of one's ability to cope or problem solve, kind of feeling like they don't know how to get out of some particular problems and they're not going away. And that feeling because of having trouble solving a problem or being in a difficult situation, those feelings of worthlessness, loneliness, and hopelessness start happening. And then they start isolating from social activities. So you may not be aware of the first two, but the third one would be a sign. If a student stops coming to class or stops communicating with you, that could be a warning sign. And then those frequent thoughts about not wanting to live, kind of feeling like you're suppressing those feelings and not feeling comfortable talking to anybody, that they can't solve problems, and then that fear of judgment from others. But treatment, the hope here is that treatment of depression is so vital, and it's very successful. A combination of therapy and medication has been proven to be very successful in treating depression. Sorry about that. Suicide's a decision that life is not worth living, but people don't want to die by suicide. People who die by suicide don't want to end their lives. They just want to end their pain. And this, breakdown of ability to adapt to life challenges is difficult. I had a client in my private practice who, when I do assessments with individuals, I always ask if they've ever had any thoughts about not wanting to live. And she said, yes, I have. And I said, well, tell me about those thoughts. What kinds of thoughts have you been having? And she said, I just have a lot of self-hate. And I said to her, well, that just tells me that you are in a lot of pain. Tell me more about that pain. So that pain is really an important thing to remember. So let's talk about the pain. It really is a root cause. I love this acronym, HOPE, hold on, pain ends. So many of us struggle with challenges in our lives that can be very painful. And there's many different causes for pain, obviously, but I want to mention a few to be aware of. One is a history of abuse or neglect, whether it's rape or child abuse, neglectful domestic violence. I have an example to share from a client who was raped as a teenager when she was 15 years old by her father's friend. And her father told her it was her fault. And she had felt like she had no one to talk to. She felt very isolated and, of course, devastated. And she felt the shame, hopelessness. And she had thoughts such as, I'm worthless, nobody would want me. And she made an attempt on her life. And she said that she's so happy she was not successful in that attempt because she ended up having a very fulfilling life. She got married, has children, successful career, but just an example of that pain with abuse. Another one I want to mention is bullying. Most of you are, I'm sure, aware of bullying. That can happen a lot, and the middle school to high school years, but also adults can bully. But it's that rejection by peers that at a time of child development where having connections with peers is so important. And there was a client that I had, young girl of Mexican descent, who was shunned by her peers, and they were telling her she was a drug dealer, and it really impacted her tremendously. Also, the LGBTQ communities 6 times more likely to make an attempt by suicide. So obviously some bullying that can happen with that community. And social media that, we have, it's such a popular way to communicate these days, but it also can be a way to be discouraging to people. And so it's something to be aware of. Another part of pain that I want to mention is a major crisis. A third of suicides there was a personal crisis that occurred in the last 2 weeks prior to making an attempt on their life. That's been pretty well known. So crises that could include a divorce or a job loss or financial crisis, military service also. 1.5 times of those that are serving our military make attempts on their lives more than the non-veterans. So this is something also, major crises. And then the last one I want to mention is chronic pain or serious illnesses. And this is for people who live in chronic pain and it's not something people can see, or if they have a serious illness, there is a sense of hopelessness around when it will end, and not being believed by others is very common. I've had clients who have struggled with chronic pain because people don't believe them and they feel shameful and embarrassed, and they end up isolating quite a bit. So this is another area that can be a cause of pain and having thoughts thoughts about not wanting to live. But that hopelessness, that's the common thread. Suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And I like to mention this because oftentimes it's a problem. Most problems can get solved, or we can find answers and get support to help people solve those problems. And it can be, sometimes suicide can be an impulsive way of just ending that pain and not knowing what to do otherwise. So now I want to share some other risk factors and warning signs. A previous suicide attempt is the highest risk factor. If somebody has made an attempt on their life, they are more likely to make another attempt. So if somebody has made an attempt, that is a high risk factor. Talking, writing, or thinking about death. This is where teachers may see some signs of any students that are writing, especially about death of some kind. Rebecca Turvo, the woman who wrote the book Shattered, apparently her son was writing some dark poems about death in his classes, and the teacher never told the parents. They found out after the fact. So keeping an eye open for anything like that that might be in your class. An increased drug or alcohol use or addiction. Oftentimes when people start overusing drug and alcohol, it starts out with need to numb some of that pain. Another risk factor is giving away possessions, especially things that mean a lot to the individual. That's a very big red flag that they may be already have a plan that they're giving things away to people. And then that easy access to a lethal means, whether it's a firearm or prescription medications. So when I do my assessments in my private practice, that is the questions that I do is I'm screening to find out if a person is at risk for suicide. When I ask them about their thoughts and what their thoughts are, how long they've had those thoughts. And then I ask the question about, I'm trying to find out if they have a plan or an intent to actually follow through with the plan. So I will usually ask, have you ever thought about how you might go about doing this? And if they say, well, yeah, I've thought about using a gun, and then I have to ask them, do you have any guns in the home? Because if they have access to it, then that's a higher risk factor. And if they have an intent, would you ever follow through with it? And they say, no, I never could do that. Then that's a positive. But if they say, yes, I have thought about it, then it's a higher risk that I may have to call 911 to make sure they're safe. So here is really probably the biggest thing I want to emphasize today is to not keep quiet or tune out or look away. If you hear anybody making comments about not wanting to live, it's very important to say something. And as we learn this suicide prevention technique today, the biggest goal is to feel comfortable asking that question so that you are prepared and not shying away from it, because it can feel very scary. But by showing concern, you could save a life just by asking. And I want to point out, it's very important to be proactive. And if you don't know already, checking in with your program policies before there's a crisis, checking with your program manager about what are the policies and steps on who you should be notifying if a student makes a suicidal comments, because you obviously are going to want to get that support. Suicide is 100% preventable by speaking up. So you may hear, if you hear students making any comments that are very direct, like the examples I have at the top, I've decided to kill myself, I wish I were dead, I'm going to commit suicide. It's very obvious, but oftentimes it might be quite vague, and that those comments also you need to pay attention to as well. I'm tired of life. What's the point of going on? Or my family would be better without me. So any comments at all, it's better to be safe than sorry, to pull aside the student to talk to them about it. So now I'm going to share a method that I think you will find very helpful. This is a evidence-based, nationally recognized suicide prevention method called QPR. I looked into many different suicide prevention methods, and this was the one that I really liked the most because it's easy to remember, just like CPR. And I'm sure you all are aware of CPR. It's just QPR, which stands for question, persuade, and refer. And this evidence-based prevention method is, I learned on, it's called QPR Institute, and you see the website at the bottom of the page. At least I think you can. I can't really see it on my page, but it's www.qprinstitute.com. So if you want any further training on this method, I would highly encourage you to go to that website and take their full training. It's very reasonable. It's only $30 for an individual to take that training if you want any more than we do today. And I do have their permission to use it. So let's talk about the 3 steps. I want to talk about these in a little more detail. The first step is the question. And I think this is the hardest part of it, is what do you say to somebody? If you hear a comment from a student, you obviously want to pull them aside privately. You don't want to do this in front of the class. And then you want to ask that question. And I don't want you to get stuck on what that question is. It doesn't matter so much how you ask the person. It's more important that you do ask the question. And so on the QPR suicide prevention handout that I asked you to pull up, I do give some examples, and you can use some of these, or you can use what you're more comfortable with. But like I said, it's most important to just get comfortable with how you might go about asking somebody. So pulling them aside, saying, I'm concerned, I heard a comment, I'm concerned about your safety, you know, how are you doing and what's going on in your life? And just asking that initial question. Other things you could say is, I'm concerned about you. Are you having any thoughts about not wanting to live? Are you okay? You seem unhappy. Are you so unhappy you're having any thoughts about not wanting to live? And then let them answer. If they say, no, I'm fine. I just had a bad morning and I didn't mean what I said. Okay, then at that point you can provide them some resources if they need it. And I do have that sheet of suicide prevention resources, and on the back side are some mental health resources as well. But if they do say, yeah, I've just, been going through a hard time, now it's time to listen. You want to listen, be open-minded. Listening is so important at a time like this, validating their concerns and then offering them some hope. So letting them know your safety is of utmost importance to me and I care about you. Please go with me to get some help. I have some great resources here and I can help walk you through that. If they are willing, then great. Then we're going to go to the referral next. If they're not and you have any concerns and they seem at high risk, then you do want to definitely contact a professional on their behalf. So there's the referral part. Hopefully they're open to it, but there are all kinds of resources available. You want to, on that resource handout, there are several crisis hotlines. They're free, they're confidential, they're 24/7 available, 24/7. The first one's the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They have a deaf and hard of hearing lifeline. They have a Spanish line. They have tele-interpreter services that support 150 languages. So this, by calling that number, they'll be connected with a professional who can then support them and get them the help that they need. They also have a chat line on their website, suicidepreventionlifeline.org. So that one is probably the top one that I would recommend. They're actually, this hasn't happened yet, but I just want to make you aware that later this year, there's it's going through a government approval right now to have a 988 line, kind of like 911, so it's easier to remember. But then also on the sheet, there is a crisis text line. You can text MN to 741-741. There is a Trevor Project hotline for LGBTQ community. There's a veterans crisis line. And then the last one I want to mention is mental health crisis team. So if there, there's been a lot of talk with revamping our police departments to include mental health professionals. And there actually is mental health professionals that have been around for a long time. They're called mental health crisis response teams. And every county has a number to call for mental health crises. And so on that suicide prevention resource page that I shared with you, there is a link, and I would encourage you to go to that link to get the number for your county, so you have that handy. So if the student is apprehensive about you calling 911 and having the police come, which I obviously do that if you think it's obviously you should do that. If that's the first thing to think of, just calling 911 is police will come, they would take them to the hospital, and then they would get evaluated at the hospital. But sometimes people really are resistant to that. And so this mental health crisis response team, they will come to your school, they will come to a workplace setting, they will go to a person's home, and then they are professionals that will evaluate them and connect them to the help that they need. So lots of different resources. You can just choose one of the resources that you would prefer to use, but making sure you have these handy to either hand to the student or to have for yourselves in your classroom. Okay, so now I think it's so important that you practice because it may sound like, oh, okay, this is good enough, but to me, it's very important that you have an opportunity to practice with somebody else. And so we're going to be putting you in a breakout room with, I believe, 3 people. So, if for some reason you're uncomfortable doing this, that's fine. Or if you get into your breakout room and you're the only one, obviously come back and Gail will put you in another group. But really want you to each take an opportunity to be the student and the other person be the teacher, and however many in your group that you each get an opportunity to practice. And I've got a role play here for you to try. And I think Rob's gonna put that in the chat box for you, but it's a student in your class who came to the US 5 years ago as a refugee. Her husband died last year. She feels alone, depressed, useless, and no longer respected. And she tells you, I don't think life is worth living. Okay, so I think Gail, you're gonna put everybody into the breakout rooms. I think we're gonna take about 15 minutes. So you have an opportunity to get comfortable with it, and then we'll come back to the group.
Okay, before I put you in, I just want to let you know that if you have a problem, like let's say you're in a room and there isn't anyone else, or if you have any other issue, just bounce back into the main room and then I can place you where you need to go, okay? Thank you. I'm going to open those in just a second.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I know there was a little bit of confusion in some of the breakout rooms getting popped out and back in, but hopefully you all got a chance to practice the role play. And then secondly, unbeknownst to me, we just kind of realized that the suicide prevention resource handout that I had mentioned earlier in the workshop was missing from the participant handout. So I just put that in the chat box, and Gail also put it in that participant handout for you to access. So I apologize for that mishap, but it's important that you do have that suicide prevention resource handout. And I also think I failed to tell you that it's 2 pages, and the second page does have more general mental health resources if a student just needs to see a therapist and it's not a high risk situation. So there's sliding fee options on that second page. So I'm wondering if anybody might be willing to share what it was like for you to practice the role play, whether you want to share it in the chat box or raise your hand and talk about your group and what happened. Anybody be willing to do that?
This is Krista Coronado. I work in Minneapolis, and I actually had a situation in early winter with a student over text message. So I shared that with my group, and just I want to emphasize the questions to go a little deeper with a student and help, make sure that they know you're there to help listen and support. And I ended up having to call 911. And interesting enough, I, in the process, wasn't sure like how much information I could give to the 911 operator. I did it. I gave the address and all of that, but I also, with the student, made sure that we had the correct information because he wanted help. Like, he was in the process of suicide, and over text messaging, we were able to get the police officers there and the ambulance, and he was admitted into the hospital. So ask the next questions.
Yes, great. Thank you for sharing that. That must have been quite scary for you. It does feel like a lot of responsibility. It sounds like you did the right thing. And just to be clear with everybody, confidentiality goes out the window when safety is an issue. So we're mandated reporters. As teachers, and me as a professional licensed psychologist, I'm a mandated reporter. So if there's any semblance of a possibility of somebody harming themselves or somebody else, you have to, actually, you're mandated. You need to call 911 or whoever you need to call. But 911, don't hesitate. You did exactly the right thing, Krista. Thank you for sharing that.
I have a question about that. Being a mandated reporter, so if I had a student call me and a similar situation like we just heard, and I worked it out and got them to a point where they were communicating that they weren't suicidal as a result of me offering hope or something like that. Would I still be required to report that, or at that point would I just let it go and follow up with the student later?
So let me make sure I'm understanding. So it was somebody who said they were having suicidal thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess what I'm asking is, if as a teacher, if you work it out with the student, and yeah, they communicated that they were having suicidal thoughts and that there was a plan, but then you end up talking to them about their issues and their problems, and they communicate that they've changed their mind. Would you still be required to report them to the authorities to have a follow-up?
You wouldn't need to call 911 in that situation, but I would highly recommend you contact somebody in their life who also knows they're struggling, so they can follow up with them and make sure they're okay. A family member, or you certainly would want your program to know about it as well. And if there's not any high risk that they're going to follow through and make an attempt, but even so, if they're, you talk to them and they change their mind, somebody does need to know about it. So whether, I would talk to them and say, I want to make sure you're safe. And so I am going to contact your family member, whoever that you could contact, or who's somebody I could contact, so they can check in with you over the weekend or whatnot. And then you would want to follow up with that person as well, check in and make sure they're doing okay when they come to class, or check in with them again. So you do want to let somebody know about it, so they can be following up and making sure they're okay.
Hey, thanks. Can you put me back on mute? I'm actually driving a truck right now, listening in on the conference.
Okay. All right. Great questions, everybody.
I have something to ask about mandated reporting.
Sure.
My district was saying that I'm not a mandated reporter because my students are adults. And I had an
No, that's not true.
Yeah, I had an instance a few months ago with a student who was in a manic state, was not making sense, and had called me, and also had refused to go to the hospital. So eventually I was trying to encourage them to go to the hospital. They got angry at me and they hung up. And so then I tried the crisis team, and I talked to the crisis team, and they said, well, if he's not willing to go to the hospital, we can't go out to his home. And they said, you need to call law enforcement, local law enforcement, for a welfare check. So then I found the non-emergency number for law enforcement, ended up with the sheriff's department for that area, and explained, because they asked me, did you call the crisis team? And I said, yes, but they won't go out because the person is not willing to go to the hospital, but they're also not in the right frame of mind to, make a good decision. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And they used a lot of indirect language about not wanting to live, not specific suicide, because I guess I had asked, are you in danger of taking your life? I was very direct actually with him. And it was like, no, nothing like that. But it ended up that the police did a welfare check. I think they had the crisis team accompany them. My student was hospitalized, and the student was just recently back with me attending class and had thanked me.
Great.
So it worked out really great, but it's not a super straightforward process.
Yes, that's true.
How can I communicate with my district about being a mandated reporter? Because there was something also with this student coming back. I was asking the district, can I ask for, a medical release? And that's a question for you too. My district said, no, we can't ask for a medical release because they're an adult. So I've, basically, welcomed them back, and, we're starting a schedule of classes again to prepare for the GED, but how about that?
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's not always straightforward. And when you're in that situation, it can be confusing about what to do. And so you did exactly the right thing. So good for you for doing that. Everyone that's giving examples all did the right thing. You showed that you cared, you reached out to them, you connected them with police or a professional. And sometimes it is not straightforward. As far as your district, I don't have control over that, but if there is any issue of safety, somebody who's saying they are going to harm themselves or harm another person, at least for me, I am mandated to contact the authorities. So because you just, it's important, obviously, whether it's a child or an adult. So I'm confused by that, what your district and why they might say they're adults, so you aren't mandated, doesn't make any sense. If somebody is threatening their life, or in a manic episode, they are vulnerable. They're vulnerable adults. So that is mandated. Clearly.
So
is
do you know
mandated.
where I would go to look for like that statute or,
Let me think.
I mean, I
about
could probably just Google it too. but-
it. Yeah,
but
yeah.
Mandated reporting is part of the Minnesota statutes or?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'll just do
And
that.
I believe teachers are part of that, being mandated.
Yeah, they were
um,
saying only their K to 12 were, and I'm like, you know,
I don't think that's true. I mean, if somebody's saying they're gonna harm themselves, or if they're in a mental health crisis, they're a vulnerable adult, and they do
okay, so
need.
make that as, yeah, that's the assessment I made. He's not safe, you know.
Right, right. So I agree with you. I don't know what your district and how they came to that conclusion, but it's probably very important to have that discussion.
Yeah, I think we need to establish a policy.
Yes, definitely.
How about the consortiums? Do they have like, good question to put out there. Like I am under the umbrella of another program, and then we're part of the Southeast Consortium out of Owatonna. So I was wondering if consortiums have,
I guess you'd have to check with that, but also being a licensed teacher, you need to check your responsibility as well.
okay,
Because, you work for whoever you work for, you're still a licensed teacher, just like
still a
me.
licensed teacher.
I'm a licensed psychologist, no matter if I'm working at PANDA or I'm working in my private practice. I'm a mandated reporter.
Okay, thanks for
I
clarifying
hope
that.
that makes sense.
It does, totally. I appreciate
Okay.
it. Thanks.
Okay, I think we're getting close to running out of time, but thank you all so much for sharing. I had a little more information here I was going to share, just about being proactive. So I'll just quickly talk about this. You're probably all aware of it, but resiliency, a lot of research has been done about resiliency and how that resilience, when people have a skill of resiliency, they can rise above adversity. And some of the factors that support resiliency are having that good support network. So your classroom, you may be the only professional some of your students ever have contact with on a regular basis, but yourselves and let the students getting to know each other provides one level of support. But also other resiliency factors are having that belief in a higher power, having determination, finding meaning and purpose in life, and being willing to seek that help. So thinking about how to teach those resiliency skills in your classroom, whether you show YouTube videos of people that have risen above very difficult situations, like for instance, Malala, the young girl who was shot in Pakistan, and Louis Zamperini from the movie Unbroken, who was a prisoner of war for years. Those, just even those movie clips are things you could show, but also talking to students about what's a time you were able to rise above a difficult situation is a good thing to share. Obviously, getting to know your students and then helping them learn how to solve problems. Some people do not have that skill. Providing problems and brainstorming solutions are things that you can think about doing in your classroom. So Gail, I think we're out of time. Am I correct? We
Yes,
didn't get to do that second breakout, but you can think about those things moving forward. Hopefully I answered all your questions. If you have any further questions, certainly feel free to reach out to me. You can email me or call me. Gail's putting up a quick poll here to rate the workshop. I hope you gained some good information today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.